There are things in life that are meant to be carried quietly, like a flame sheltered from the wind. Not everything that grows within you is meant to be spoken aloud, and not every ear is prepared to hold the weight of your truth. In a world that encourages constant sharing, constant revealing, and constant explaining, wisdom often begins where silence is chosen, because the more sacred something is to your journey, the more carefully it must be protected. And tonight, we are going to talk about those 7 things, things that, when kept within the right boundaries, can protect your peace, preserve your power, and guide you toward a stronger version of yourself. There are struggles that shape a person long before the world ever notices them. Silent battles do not announce themselves with noise or warning. They live in the quiet hours, in the moments when no one is watching, when the heart is heavy, but the face is forced to remain steady. And in those moments, a person learns something sacred about survival. Not every pain is meant to be displayed, and not every wound is meant to be explained. Because the truth is, the world does not always respond to your suffering with understanding. Sometimes it responds with curiosity, sometimes with judgment, and often with a kind of indifference that makes you wish you had never spoken at all. There is a delicate strength in choosing what remains unseen. When you share your deepest struggles with those who lack the capacity to hold them gently, you do not find relief. You often find exposure. And exposure in the wrong hands can turn into misunderstanding. People may not always hear your pain as pain. They may interpret it as weakness, or worse, as something to be used against you later. That is why silence, in its highest form, is not emptiness. It is protection. It is the quiet wisdom of knowing that your healing does not require an audience to be real. You are still valid even when no one knows what you are going through. And yet, there is something even more profound in learning to stand within your storms without constantly seeking external validation. When you stop performing your pain for sympathy, you begin to understand your own resilience in a deeper way. You realize that you have survived days that would have broken you if you had depended on the approval or understanding of others. Not every tear needs an explanation. Not every struggle needs to be translated into words for someone else to approve of your strength. Some battles are meant to refine you in silence, to carve wisdom into your spirit where applause cannot reach. So you learn, slowly and sometimes painfully, that discretion is not isolation. It is discernment. It is the understanding that your inner world is sacred, and sacred things are not meant to be placed in careless hands. You do not owe everyone access to your most fragile moments. You owe yourself the dignity of healing without interruption, of growing without distortion, of becoming whole without the pressure of being understood by those who were never meant to understand you. In that quiet decision lies a power that cannot be taken from you, the power to choose what remains yours and what the world is simply not ready to hold. There is a fragile kind of power that lives inside every intention you are still shaping, every dream that has not yet taken its full form. In its early stage, a vision is like something tender in your hands, alive, but not yet strong enough to stand against the weight of other people's opinions. It is still learning how to exist in the world, still gathering strength in silence, still becoming what it is meant to be. And in that state, it does not need noise around it. It needs protection. When you begin to speak too early, when you begin to reveal what is still growing in private corners of your mind, you unknowingly place it into environments that may not be safe for it. Not every listener will meet your vision with respect. Some will meet it with doubt disguised as advice, others with subtle discouragement hidden in casual words, and a few with something far more dangerous: silent resistance that you cannot always see but can always feel. There are people who will smile at your ambition while quietly hoping it never comes alive. And this is not always because they are cruel. Sometimes it is because your growth reminds them of what they have not yet built in themselves. So a quiet truth begins to unfold. Not every idea is ready for conversation. Some ideas are still in their forming stage, still learning how to breathe. When you expose them too soon, you allow external voices to interfere with something that was meant to be guided by your own belief alone. Doubt spreads easily in environments where confidence has not yet fully matured. A single careless comment can make a growing dream hesitate, and hesitation is often the beginning of abandonment. There is wisdom in allowing your future to remain private until it becomes strong enough to stand without shaking at the sound of other people's uncertainty. When something is still delicate, it does not need exposure, it needs incubation. It needs the quiet repetition of your own belief, the steady discipline of your actions, the unseen hours where you continue building even when no one is watching. That is where real strength forms, not in announcement, but in development. And so you begin to understand that silence is not secrecy born out of fear, it is strategy born out of awareness. It is the recognition that not every space is meant to hold your becoming. There is a time for sharing, yes, but there is also a time for safeguarding what is not yet ready to withstand interference. When you learn to keep your future plans close enough to your heart that they are nourished by your focus rather than fragmented by opinion, you give them something rare in this world: protection long enough to become reality. There are places inside a person that words can reach, and there are places words can never truly touch unless they are spoken with care, patience, and understanding. Emotional wounds belong to that deeper place. They are not always visible, yet they shape the way a person sees the world, trusts others, and even learns to trust themselves again. And when those wounds are still open, still tender, still learning how to close, they require something far more delicate than advice or opinion. They require gentleness. But life often teaches something different first. It teaches that not every listener is prepared to hold your pain without reshaping it through their own perspective. Some people hear your wounds and immediately try to fix them, not realizing that healing is not always about quick solutions. Others hear your pain and, without meaning to, turn it into judgment, asking why you didn't leave sooner, why you stayed longer, why you didn't see what they now claim is obvious. And in that moment, your vulnerability becomes something heavy, something exposed, something that feels less like healing and more like being placed under a light that is too harsh. There is a quiet difference between someone who listens to understand and someone who listens to respond. One creates space for your truth to exist without distortion. The other reshapes your truth until it fits their comfort. And when you are already hurting, that difference matters more than anything, because a wounded heart does not need correction, it needs presence. It needs someone who can sit with what is unspoken, who can hear the weight behind the words, who understands that sometimes silence between sentences carries more meaning than the sentences themselves. Healing is not a performance. It is not something that becomes stronger when it is analyzed by too many voices. In fact, too many voices can scatter the process, turning clarity into confusion and reflection into doubt. There is something sacred about allowing yourself to feel without being interrupted, to process without being evaluated, to rebuild without being constantly questioned. Not every stage of healing is meant to be witnessed, because not every witness will understand the fragility of what is being rebuilt. And so you begin to learn a difficult but necessary truth. Access to your pain must be chosen carefully. Not everyone who asks is meant to know, and not everyone who knows is meant to understand. Some people are observers, not caretakers of your emotional world. And when you give your wounds to someone who lacks the ability to hold them with care, you do not find relief. You often find distortion. Your pain is no longer just yours. It becomes interpreted, labeled, and sometimes even minimized. There is strength in recognizing that healing does not require an audience to be real. It does not require validation to be valid. Some of your most important recoveries will happen in private, where your spirit is not questioned, where your emotions are not analyzed, where you are allowed to simply be in process. And in that quiet space, away from judgment and noise, Something begins to mend in a way that words never could. There is a kind of loyalty that does not need an audience to prove its strength. It lives quietly within the walls of a home, in the shared silences between people who have endured both joy and difficulty together. Family, in its truest form, is not a performance for public observation. It is a living bond shaped by history, by shared responsibility, and by moments that are too complex to be fully understood by those who have never lived them. And yet, in a world that often turns private lives into public conversation, one of the most important forms of respect becomes learning what must remain inside. Every family carries its own storms. Some are spoken about openly, others are carried in silence, and many exist somewhere in between, felt deeply but never fully explained. These struggles are not created for interpretation by outsiders, because outsiders rarely see the full picture. They see fragments, moments, and isolated events, and from those fragments they build assumptions. But assumptions are never the full truth. They lack the context of history, emotion, sacrifice, and the invisible efforts that hold a family together even when things are difficult. When private matters are shared too freely, something delicate begins to shift. What once belonged to the sacred space of home becomes subject to external opinions. And opinions, even when well-meaning, do not always carry understanding. They often come with simplifications that overlook emotional depth. A situation that is complex becomes reduced to something easily judged. A misunderstanding becomes advice. A private disagreement becomes public commentary. And slowly, what was once a space for healing turns into a space of exposure. There is a quiet dignity in choosing not to turn your home into a topic of conversation. It is not about denying reality or pretending that struggles do not exist. It is about recognizing that not every struggle needs to be explained to those who have no responsibility for it. Some matters are meant to be resolved within the circle of those who are actually part of it, where intentions are known, histories are shared, and forgiveness has room to grow without interference. And within that choice lies protection. Because when family struggles are spoken about without care, they can become distorted. People outside the situation may begin to form narratives that do not reflect truth, but rather interpretation. And once those narratives are formed, they often return in ways that create more tension than resolution. What was once a temporary misunderstanding can become a lasting impression in the minds of those who were never meant to judge it. So there is wisdom in restraint, wisdom in knowing that some things are too personal to be broadcast and too sacred to be explained in fragments. A family does not become stronger through public approval, it becomes stronger through private effort, through conversations held behind closed doors, through understanding that is built slowly and patiently without outside noise shaping it. And when you learn to protect that space, you are not hiding the truth, you are honoring it. You are preserving the dignity of people who are still learning, still growing, still trying in their own imperfect ways, because not everything that is real is meant to be shared, and not everything that is shared is understood in the way it was lived. There is a quiet kind of strength that does not announce itself before it arrives. It does not seek permission, nor does it ask for validation while it is still forming. It simply continues, step by step, often unnoticed, until the results begin to speak in a language far clearer than words ever could. In a world where everything is often shared too early, too quickly, and too openly, there is something deeply powerful about choosing not to reveal what is still under construction. A person's next move is often most fragile at the beginning. It is in that early stage where doubt can enter easily, where opinions can interfere, and where energy can be scattered before anything has truly taken shape. Words, when spoken too soon, can sometimes create a false sense of completion. The mind begins to feel as if something has already been achieved simply because it has been described. But intention alone is not achievement. Vision alone is not completion. And conversation, no matter how passionate, cannot replace the discipline of consistent action. There is also something important about the way silence protects focus. When everything is spoken aloud, attention begins to divide. Instead of building, a part of the mind starts managing perception, how others will react, what they will think, whether they will approve. And slowly, the original purpose becomes secondary to the desire for external acknowledgement. But when silence is chosen, energy remains undisturbed. It stays directed inward, steady and unbroken, allowing effort to accumulate without distraction. Not every observer will understand what you are building. Some will misjudge the process, others will underestimate it, and some may not see it at all until it is already complete. And that is the natural nature of growth. It does not always announce itself in a way that is visible to everyone. What matters is not how early it is recognized, but how fully it is formed when it finally arrives in the open. There is also a certain dignity in allowing results to speak on your behalf. Results do not need explanation. They do not need defense or justification. They stand as they are, shaped by time, effort, and persistence. And when something is strong enough to stand on its own, it no longer requires introduction. It simply exists, and its existence becomes undeniable. Silence during the process is not absence. It is preparation. It is the space where ideas are refined, where discipline is tested, and where consistency builds something that cannot be easily shaken by outside influence. In that quiet space, progress becomes more honest, because it is no longer influenced by the desire to impress. It is driven purely by commitment. And when the moment finally comes for your work to be seen, it does not arrive as a promise. It arrives as evidence. At that point, no explanation is necessary, because what was once hidden in silence now speaks clearly through its results. There is a kind of goodness that exists quietly, without announcement, without expectation, and without the need to be seen in order to feel complete. It moves through a person like breath, natural and unforced, asking for nothing in return except the simple alignment of the heart with what is right. But in a world where even sincerity is often measured through visibility, it becomes easy to forget that the purest form of kindness does not always need witnesses. The moment kindness begins to seek recognition, something subtle changes within it. It is no longer just an offering from the heart. It begins to carry an awareness of how it will be received, how it will be interpreted, and whether it will be acknowledged. And in that shift, the innocence of the act slowly becomes layered with expectation. A simple gesture that was once free begins to carry weight, not because it has become less valuable, but because it is now tied to how it is perceived. There is nothing wrong with wanting appreciation, but there is a deeper difference between appreciation and validation. Appreciation acknowledges goodness, validation depends on it, and when kindness becomes dependent on validation, it begins to lose its natural rhythm. It becomes something performed rather than something lived. The focus quietly shifts from the act itself to the response it might receive, and in that shift, the purity of intention becomes less certain. True kindness does not need to be announced in order to exist. In fact, some of the most meaningful gestures in life are the ones that remain unnamed, unnoticed, and unrecorded. They are given freely, not as a transaction, but as a reflection of inner character. And because they are not performed for recognition, they retain something rare, authenticity, untouched by expectation. When kindness is done in silence, it carries a different kind of strength. It does not become weaker for being unseen. It becomes purer. It exists in its own truth, independent of applause or acknowledgement. And in that independence, it remains unshaped by external judgment. It does not change depending on who is watching. It does not grow or shrink based on approval. It simply is. But when kindness is repeatedly shared for validation, it can slowly begin to lose its natural sincerity. The intention becomes divided. A part of it still wants to help, but another part begins to watch for reaction. And over time, this quiet division can make even genuine acts feel less grounded. What was once effortless begins to feel measured. What was once natural begins to feel observed. There is a deeper peace in allowing goodness to remain unspoken. Not because it should be hidden, but because it does not require exposure to have meaning. A life shaped by quiet kindness is not less impactful. It is often more stable, more sincere, and more aligned with something that does not depend on external approval to feel real. And in that quiet space, kindness returns to what it was always meant to be, not a performance, not a reflection of how others see you, but a simple expression of who you are when no one is asking you to be anything at all. There is a quiet vulnerability in every human being that does not reveal itself easily, yet it exists within everyone without exception. It is carried in the moments where confidence wavers, where doubt speaks louder than certainty, and where the inner world feels softer than the outer appearance suggests. These are not flaws in the way people often assume. They are simply parts of being human. But what becomes dangerous is not the existence of vulnerability. It is the placement of it in the wrong hands. Trust is something that is built slowly, often through repeated experiences, shared moments, and the subtle feeling of being understood without having to over-explain. Yet trust, once given, does not always remain in the form it was intended. Some people hold it gently, recognizing its weight and value. Others, however, may not fully understand the responsibility that comes with it. And in those hands, what was once shared in confidence can be reshaped into something unintended. There are conversations that feel safe in the moment, where opening up feels like relief, like finally setting something heavy down. But not every listener carries the same intention beyond that moment. Some remember not to protect, but to repeat. Some observe not to understand, but to use. And slowly, what was once a moment of honesty becomes something stored in someone else's memory for purposes that were never yours to control. Weakness, when spoken in the presence of the untrustworthy, loses its private nature. It becomes information, and information in the wrong context can be reshaped into advantage, manipulation, or misunderstanding. What you once shared as human honesty may later return to you in conversations where it no longer belongs to your story, but to someone else's interpretation of it. And that shift can quietly change the way you are seen, not because of who you are, but because of how your vulnerability was carried by others. There is a difference between being open and being unguarded without discernment. Openness is a choice made with awareness. It is selective, intentional, and grounded in understanding who can hold what is shared. But unguarded trust, given too quickly or too freely, can sometimes place emotional parts of yourself in environments that are not equipped to protect them. And once something personal leaves your hands, you can no longer control how it will be shaped in the minds of others. This is not a call to silence yourself completely, nor to build walls around every feeling you have. It is a reminder that not every space is equal, and not every listener is a keeper of what is sacred. There is wisdom in observing before revealing, in understanding before opening, in allowing trust to be earned rather than assumed. Because once your weaknesses are known by those who do not value them with care, they can be turned into something you never intended them to become. Not because you were wrong to feel, but because you were generous in a place where generosity was not met with responsibility. And so the quiet strength lies in choosing carefully, in recognizing that trust is not just about connection, but about safety, and in protecting what is tender within you, not out of fear, but out of respect for the person you are still becoming. There is something deeply sacred about the connections we form with others, especially the ones that shape our emotional world in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Personal relationships are not just interactions between two people, they are living spaces built on shared understanding, unspoken agreements, and moments that belong only to those within them. And like anything sacred, they lose their depth when they are exposed to too many voices that were never part of their creation. In the beginning, most relationships are simple in their essence. There is connection, curiosity, and the slow building of trust. But over time, as emotions deepen and histories become shared, these relationships begin to form their own private language. It is a language that is not always logical to outsiders because it is built on experience rather than explanation. And when something so personal is translated too often for public understanding, it begins to lose its original meaning. There is a quiet danger in allowing outside opinions to become part of what should remain between two people. The moment a relationship is repeatedly opened for analysis, it stops being experienced directly and starts being observed indirectly. And observation changes perception. People who are not living the reality begin to interpret it, and interpretation is rarely complete. It is shaped by personal bias, limited information, and emotional distance. What they see is only a fragment, yet their conclusions may feel whole to them. This is how something intimate begins to fracture, not always through conflict, but through commentary. Too many voices can create confusion where there was once clarity. Advice may begin to replace understanding. Judgments may begin to replace empathy. And slowly, the people inside the relationship may start seeing their own connection through the lens of others, rather than through their own lived experience. Boundaries, in this sense, are not barriers that keep love out. They are structures that protect love from distortion. They allow two people to remain connected without constantly filtering their emotions through external approval or criticism. When a relationship is protected by boundaries, it has the space to evolve naturally without being reshaped by outside expectations or misinterpretations. There is also a certain strength in not explaining every detail of your emotional life to those who are not part of it. Not every question deserves a full answer, and not every concern requires public clarification. Some things grow stronger when they are not constantly examined. Like something delicate under steady care, relationships often need room to breathe without being constantly placed under judgment. And in that privacy, something important begins to happen. Understanding deepens without performance. Patience grows without explanation. And connection becomes less about how it appears and more about how it feels to those who are actually living it. That is where intimacy truly survives, not in visibility, but in sincerity. Because in the end, what belongs between two hearts does not need a crowd to validate its existence. It only needs protection from becoming something it was never meant to be, a topic, a debate, or a story told by people who were never part of its truth.